The Sunday morning that changed Jennie Donnelly's life forever began with cracked earth, an empty sky, and a traveling preacher standing in the bed of a borrowed wagon telling her that God had a plan. She stood at the back of the small crowd gathered outside the Millhaven Community Hall, her calloused hands folded in front of her Sunday dress, her dark hair pinned beneath a bonnet that had seen better years. The dress itself had been mended twice at the hem and once at the left cuff, but she wore it with the quiet dignity of a woman who had learned that pride cost nothing if you kept it inside where it counted. Around her stood the scattered souls of Millhaven, Texas, a ranching settlement of perhaps 200 people spread across the dry brown hills south of the Pecos River in the summer of 1883. The drought had been going on for 11 weeks. 11 weeks without meaningful rain. 11 weeks of watching her corn twist and yellow and curl toward death. The preacher was a compact man named Reverend Elias Cobb, who traveled a circuit through West Texas and New Mexico territory in a wagon painted with the word salvation is NEAR in red letters on both sides. He had arrived in Millhaven the evening before, taken supper with the Hargrove family, and announced he would hold a service the following morning to pray for rain. Half the town had come out, which was more than came on a regular Sunday, because desperation has its own kind of gospel. The Lord hears every cry of his people, Reverend Cobb was saying, his voice carrying across the stillness of the hot morning with practiced authority. He heard the cry of Israel in the wilderness. He heard the cry of Elijah on the mountain, and he will hear the cry of the faithful people of Millhaven, Texas, if they raise their voices together and trust in his mercy. Jennie pressed her lips together. She was not a faithless woman. She had been raised Methodist, had married in a church, had buried her husband Thomas Donnelly in the churchyard behind the white-painted building in San Angelo 3 years ago, when Thomas had been thrown from a horse and broken his neck before he ever reached the age of 34. She still believed in God, but she had learned in the years since Thomas's death that God helped those who worked their fingers to the bone alongside their prayers, and what she needed right now was not a sermon. She needed water in her irrigation ditch. The Donnelly farm sat on 40 acres at the eastern edge of Millhaven, watered by a hand-dug irrigation channel that drew from Cutter Creek about 1.5 miles north of her property. Thomas had designed the system himself in the first year of their marriage, and for 4 years it had worked well enough. But the previous autumn, a section of the ditch's stone and clay lining had collapsed in a flash flood, and the repair had never been finished properly because Thomas was already gone and Jennie had patched it herself with what she could manage alone. That bad patch had held through the winter and into spring, but now in the punishing heat of late July, the ditch was losing water through the damaged section faster than it was gaining it from the creek. Her corn crop, which represented nearly all of her income for the year, was dying row by row. She had $300 saved in a tin box beneath the floorboards of her kitchen, which was almost exactly what she owed the bank in Pecos come October. There was no margin. There was no slack. Every morning she rose before dawn and walked the length of her irrigation ditch with a lantern, pushing wet clay into cracks with her bare hands, and every morning the sun rose and baked her repairs back into dust. She needed someone who knew how to build a proper stone lining. She needed a mason, or a man who had worked with stone and mortar, or simply a strong pair of hands guided by someone who understood how water moved. And she needed it in the next 2 weeks, or the corn would be lost entirely, and the bank would take the farm in October, and she and her 7-year-old daughter Clara would be left with nothing but the road. Reverend Cobb was now calling for everyone to bow their heads, and Jennie bowed hers, but her eyes did not fully close. She was watching the dry ground at her feet, the cracked caliche soil that was the color of old bone, and she was thinking about water with the cold, precise focus of someone who has run out of the luxury of distraction. "Lord, we ask you to open the windows of heaven," Reverend Cobb intoned, his hands raised toward the cloudless blue dome of the sky. "We ask you to send the rain upon this parched and suffering land. We ask it in faith, and we trust in your perfect timing. I can do better than that." The voice came from the back of the crowd, and it was low and unhurried, and carried in it the particular quality of a man who did not speak often but meant everything he said when he did. Jennie turned, along with everyone else, and saw him for the first time. He was standing at the far edge of the gathering, leaning against the hitching post outside the hall with his arms crossed over his chest and one boot heel hooked on the lowest rail. He was tall and lean in the way that men who work outdoors in hard country tend to be lean, not thin, but spare, every ounce of him serving a purpose. He wore a faded blue chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, trail-worn canvas trousers, and a hat that had been good once and still did its job. His face was tanned deep brown, angular in the jaw, with dark eyes that were squinted slightly against the morning sun. He looked to be somewhere in his early 30s, though the sun and wind had a way of aging a man's face faster than his years warranted. Reverend Cobb blinked at the interruption. Several people shifted uncomfortably. Old Henry Hargrove turned around with a scowl. But the man at the hitching post had already pushed himself upright and was looking not at Reverend Cobb but at something further away, or perhaps somewhere specific, and his expression was not disrespectful or mocking. It was simply direct. "I said I can do better," he repeated, calmly but loud enough for all to hear. "Begging your pardon, Reverend, I mean no offense to the prayer. But praying for rain in West Texas in July, while there's a broken irrigation ditch going unrepaired, is like praying for a full stomach while there's a smokehouse full of beef going unused." He paused. "I was riding by Mrs. Donnelly's place yesterday evening, and I could see from the road that her ditch has got a section that's failed. If she'll allow me, I'll ride out there today and see what can be done." The crowd turned to look at Jennie, and she felt the heat in her face that had nothing to do with the July sun. She did not know this man. She had never seen him before in Millhaven, and Millhaven was small enough that she would have noticed a man who looked like that. He was a stranger, clearly passing through or newly arrived, and here he was volunteering himself in front of the whole town and looking at her with those dark, steady eyes as though her answer mattered more than anything else in the world at that particular moment. She straightened her spine. "You know irrigation work?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I do." She looked at him for a moment longer, long enough to read what she could in a man's face from 40 feet away, which was not nothing for a woman who had been alone for 3 years and had learned to judge quickly and accurately. He looked back at her with the same steadiness, waiting. "Then you are welcome to come and look," she said. Reverend Cobb cleared his throat, adjusted his coat, and said that God worked through many instruments, and they finished the prayer. And when Jennie turned back around after the amen, the man was already walking toward a big gray horse tied further down the street, and swinging himself into the saddle with the easy motion of someone who had spent most of his life horseback. His name, she learned when he rode up to her fence gate 20 minutes later and introduced himself, was Harlan Crawford. He removed his hat when he said it, which she noted, and he shook her hand once with a firm, dry grip rather than the soft, uncertain handshake some men offered a widow as though uncertain how much pressure she could withstand. "Harlan Crawford," she repeated. "Are you from around here?" "No, ma'am. I've been working a cattle drive out of the Davis Mountains, headed to the railroad at Pico's. I came through Millhaven 2 days ago to rest my horse and decided to stay a few extra days." He looked past her toward the cornfield, squinting. "I was a ranch hand and a ditch builder before I got into cattle work. Spent 3 years on an irrigation project over in the Rio Grande Valley in New Mexico Territory." "Is that so?" Jennie said, studying him. "Yes, ma'am." He said it simply, without any apparent need for her to be impressed by it. She opened the gate. "Then come and see." She walked him out to the ditch, along the path she had walked so many times in the past weeks that her feet knew every rock and root along it. Clara, her daughter, trailed behind them at a careful distance, watching the stranger with the serious brown eyes she had inherited from Thomas. Clara was a quiet child who formed opinions slowly and kept them firmly once formed. The damaged section of the ditch was obvious once you were looking for it. A stretch of perhaps 20 feet where the clay lining had been patched and repatched, and was now more gap than clay, the water seeping through into the surrounding soil and spreading into a wet patch of mud that gave way to dry cracked ground just a few yards further on. Jennie's corn on either side of the bad section was the sorriest corn on the farm, the stalks barely knee-high and yellowed at the edges, while the properly watered sections showed green stalks that were at least hopeful. Harlan Crawford crouched down at the edge of the ditch and looked at the damaged section for a long time without saying anything. He reached in and pressed the clay with his thumb, pulled it out and rubbed it between his fingers. He stood up and walked the length of the bad section from one end to the other, looking at the angle and the slope. Then he walked back to her. "It's not just the lining," he said. "The section has settled, the ground underneath has shifted. Your patchwork has been holding the water back well enough under normal conditions, but when the ditch runs full in summer irrigation, it's pushing against the weak spots. You need the section dug out and relayed properly, and you need some flat rock set in the bottom and sides to give it a solid base. The clay alone won't hold without the stone underneath." "I know," Jennie said quietly. "I knew all winter that it needed proper fixing. She stopped. You just didn't have the help," he said, not as a question. "No," she said, "I didn't." He looked back at the ditch, then at the corn, calculating something privately. "I'll need to dig it out about 18 inches deeper than it sits now. Then lay the stone, then the clay on top of that. With the right materials, I can have it done in 2 days, maybe 3 if the stone is hard to get." "Where would the stone come from?" "That creek bank north of here, Cutter Creek. I'm guessing that's your source. I saw good flat limestone along the north bank when I passed it. We'd need to haul it down." Jennie watched him. He had said "we" without appearing to notice he had said it. "I can't pay you very much," she said. "I have very little to spare." He looked at her then, and the look on his face was not pity and it was not calculation either. It was something more careful and considered than either of those things. "I didn't ask to be paid," he said. "A man should be paid for his work," she said firmly. "A man should do the work that needs doing," he replied. "Let me have a look at your lumber situation and see what else we'll need, and then we can talk about what's fair." She should have argued further, but she was practical enough to know that arguing with a man offering to solve the most urgent problem in her life was a poor use of the morning. She showed him the small lumber pile behind the barn, the box of tools in the tool shed, the team of mules, sturdy animals named Ben and Moses, and the old stone boat she used to haul things across the property. He nodded at each of these as though checking inventory, and she watched him move around her farm with a kind of purposeful quiet that she found herself responding to in a way she did not have time to examine. Clara had crept closer by this point and was standing near the mule pen, watching Harlan Crawford with those serious eyes. He noticed her after a moment and tipped his hat to her with a gravity that suggested he was treating a 7-year-old with the full courtesy owed to a person, which made Clara blink and then smile a small, surprised smile. "That's Clara," Jennie said. "Ma'am," Harlan said to Clara. "Hello," Clara said carefully. He went back to studying the tool shed. Jennie watched her daughter watching him. They started work the next morning before sunrise. Harlan arrived at Jennie's gate at the first gray light of dawn with his horse carrying 2 gunny sacks of supplies he'd gotten from Ed Crane's general store in town, fresh clay compound, some iron implements for digging, a block and tackle for moving heavy stone. He had been at the store when it opened Saturday evening, apparently, and had paid for the supplies himself, which Jennie only discovered when she tried to add the cost to the accounting she was doing in her head, and Harlan said quietly that he had already taken care of it and she should not worry about it. "That is not acceptable, Mr. Crawford," she said. "Harlan," he corrected, already unhitching the stone boat from the barn wall. "And it is acceptable, Mrs. Donnelly, because those supplies cost less than a hotel room in Pico's, and I was going to spend the money one way or the other." She stared at him. He was already pulling on work gloves and studying the angle of the ditch with the early light coming across it. She made a decision, which was that she would make him the finest meals she could manage for every day he worked here, and that would be her half of the transaction, and he could accept it or ride away. He accepted it without complaint. When breakfast appeared at 6 o'clock, biscuits and thick-sliced salt pork and coffee so strong it would stand a spoon, and ate with the focused efficiency of a man who understood that food was fuel and the day was long. Clara sat across the table from him and ate her own breakfast while conducting what appeared to be a silent assessment of the stranger at her mother's table, and when she was finished, she announced that she was going to go feed the chickens, which was her morning job, and went to do it. Harlan watched her go. "She's a serious young lady," he said. "She is," Jennie agreed. "She was that way even before her father died. Thomas always said she came out of the womb already thinking something over." There was a small quiet after she said Thomas's name. She was used to that quiet by now, the way people got careful around the mention of a dead husband, not sure what expression to wear. But Harlan just nodded thoughtfully as though the information had been given to him plain and he received it plain. "How long has it been?" he asked. 3 years this past April," she said. "His horse threw him. It was fast, at least." She paused, looking at her coffee. "Or that is what I tell myself. I wasn't there." "I'm sorry," he said, and the simplicity of it was better than any of the elaborate condolences she had received from people who had known Thomas and her both. "Thank you," she said. She looked up. "What about you, family?" Something moved across his face quickly and was gone. "No," he said, "not anymore. My mother passed when I was 19, father before that. I had a brother, Cal, but he died of a fever in New Mexico 5 years ago." He said it without self-pity but with the particular flatness of a man who has accepted certain losses as permanent fixtures of his life. "I'm sorry," she said, meaning it as simply as he had. He nodded once and pushed back from the table and went to work. He worked like she had never seen a man work, and she had grown up on a farm and been married to a hardworking man and had worked very hard herself. There was nothing showy about it. He simply applied himself to the task with a steady, relentless competence that did not hurry and did not slow down. He dug out the bad section of the ditch with a long-handled spade, cutting the sides clean and true, and piling the removed earth to one side with a neatness that she could see was not just habit but understanding. He was keeping the soil in order so he could read what was underneath. When he got down to the subgrade and found the problem, a layer of soft caliche that had dissolved in the autumn flood and left a void beneath the original lining, he called her over to look at it. "Here," he said, pointing, "this is your trouble. The whole bed dropped about 3 inches when that void formed. Everything you patched on top was sitting on nothing." Jennie looked into the trench. The void was clear now that it was exposed, a hollow space packed loosely with crumbled chalky earth. "Can it be fixed?" "Yes," he said simply. "We pack this back solid, lay a gravel bed for drainage, then the flat stone, then clay on top. It won't fail again, not in your lifetime." She looked at him kneeling in the trench, his hands dirty to the elbow, speaking with the calm certainty of a man who knows his business, and she felt something shift inside her chest that she was not prepared for and immediately set aside to examine later. They drove the mule team to Cutter Creek that afternoon to haul stone, and Harlan showed her how to read the limestone, which pieces were the right thickness and flatness, which ones would split in the wrong direction, which were sound all the way through. He let her make some of the selections herself, talking her through the reasoning, and she absorbed everything he said with the quick attention of a woman who had learned by necessity to understand every system that kept her farm alive. Clara rowed on the stone boat for the trip home, sitting among the limestone pieces like a small empress, having decided at some point during the day that Harlan Crawford was acceptable. That evening, after Harlan had ridden back to the small boarding house on the main street of Millhaven where he was staying, Jennie sat on the porch in the last of the daylight and let herself think about the day. It had been a strange day. Strange in a way that was not unpleasant. She was accustomed to managing everything alone, had armored herself into a competent solitude over the past 3 years, and the presence of a capable, quiet person working alongside her had felt like setting down a weight she had forgotten she was carrying. She did not let herself think anything beyond that. She was a practical woman. He would be done in 2 or 3 days, and he would ride to Pico's, and that would be the end of it. The second day was harder than the first. The stonework required more hands than 2 people had between them, and Jennie worked right beside Harlan in the trench, passing stone, steadying pieces while he mortared them with a clay and lime mixture he had prepared, using a level he had brought in his saddlebags to keep the course true. Her arms ached. Her back ached. She did not say so. She caught him looking at her once with an expression that was part concern and part something else she could not name, and she looked back at him steadily until he looked away. At midday she brought lunch out to the ditch, cold cornbread and beans and more of the strong coffee, and they sat on the bank in the shade of the willow tree that grew at the bend and ate without much talking. A roadrunner appeared on the far bank of the ditch and considered them with its tilted, ancient-looking head, then disappeared into the brush. "Do you like cattle work?" Jennie asked. "It's good work," Harlan said, chewing. "Not what I'd have chosen for my whole life, but it pays. I spent a while thinking I'd have my own land someday. Ditch work, irrigation, that kind of thing. There's good money in it if you know it right." He was quiet a moment. "That was when my brother was alive. We talked about going in together somewhere. Get a piece of land, run stock, irrigate it properly." He looked at the ditch work they had done. "Cal was better with cattle than I ever was. I was more suited to the dirt end of it." "Why didn't you after he was gone?" she asked. He considered the question without appearing to find it too personal. "No reason to hurry, I suppose. A man on his own doesn't need much land." She thought about that. She thought about what it meant to have no reason to hurry, and what it meant to have every reason in the world and still be going slowly because there was only one of you. "No," she said. "I suppose he doesn't." That evening, while Harlan was rinsing his hands at the pump and preparing to ride back to town, Clara appeared at his elbow with the seriousness of a judge and presented him with a fistful of the small yellow wildflowers that grew along the fence line. She held them out without saying anything, her face arranged into an expression of considerable dignity. Harlan looked at the flowers. Then he looked at Clara. He took them with a care that suggested he understood they were not just flowers and said, "Thank you, Miss Clara. These are the finest flowers I have seen in a long time." Clara nodded as though this was an appropriate response and went inside. Jennie was watching from the porch doorway, and when Harlan looked up and caught her watching, she felt the color rise in her face again. She turned and went inside to start supper. She lay awake that night for a long time, which was not unusual. What was unusual was the direction her thoughts kept going. She kept seeing his hands on the stone, measuring, placing, adjusting. She kept hearing his voice saying it won't fail again, not in your lifetime, with that quiet certainty. She kept seeing Clara's flowers in his hand. She pressed these images flat and told herself that she was tired, and that tired women had fanciful thoughts, and that tomorrow the work would be finished and he would leave. On the morning of the third day, they were joined by 2 of Jennie's neighbors, Abel Frost, who farmed the land to the north of her, and his teenage son Denton, who had heard from someone in town what was happening and had come to help with the hauling. Abel was a taciturn man who communicated mostly in grunts but could move stone all day without showing fatigue, and with his help and Denton's, the final section of the lining went in before noon. Harlan walked the entire channel from the intake at Cutter Creek to the point where it fed Jennie's fields, checking for any other weak spots, making 2 small repairs that he pointed out to her so she would know what to watch for. At noon, Abel and Denton took their leave, and Harlan stood at the head of the ditch where the water came in from the creek, and they opened the intake board together and watched the water come down the channel. It moved clean and steady and true, no seeping, no spreading, and when it reached the repaired section, it flowed over the new stone bed without hesitation and ran on toward the corn rows with a sound like something alive and purposeful. Jennie stood at the repaired section, watching the water flow past it, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight for weeks. Just the sight of the water moving correctly, doing what it was supposed to do, sustaining life instead of bleeding away into the ground, undid her in a way that the prospect of losing the farm had not, and she found suddenly that her eyes were wet. She turned away so he would not see. He saw. "Mrs. Donnelly," he said quietly. "Jennie." The sound of her first name in his voice, the way he said it, low and careful, like something being handled gently, made her turn back. She did not have any defense prepared for the expression on his face, which was not pity and not discomfort, but something she had not had directed at her in 3 years and had nearly forgotten existed. It was simply care, the open, uncomplicated care of a person who means you well. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was steady even if her eyes were not. "It was good work to do," he said. He was looking at her in a way that was direct and careful at the same time, as though he understood exactly what he was looking at and was making a decision about what to say next and choosing every word precisely. "The corn will come back. You've got enough of the growing season left. It'll be thin, but it'll yield something." "I know," she said. "I know it will." She wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist. "I'm not crying about the corn." "I know that too," he said. They stood at the edge of the ditch while the water ran past them toward her field, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that has content in it. "Will you stay for supper before you ride back to town?" she asked. "A proper supper, not just coffee." He hesitated for just a moment, the first hesitation she had seen from him, and then said yes. She made roast chicken and gravy and cornbread, and the last of the canned green beans she had put up the previous autumn, and she set the table with the good plates she only used when she had company, which she almost never did. Clara set an extra place with solemn precision, arranging the cutlery with the careful geometry of a child who has decided something is important. They ate as the sun went down, and the kitchen filled with the golden evening light that came through the west window, and Harlan ate 2 helpings of everything, and said it was the best meal he had had since leaving the Rio Grande Valley, which she thought might not be high praise, and then thought might actually be very high praise, depending on what you knew about the Rio Grande Valley. Clara talked more at supper than she had all day, telling Harlan about the chickens and their individual personalities, about the cat named General Sherman who lived in the barn and was very old, about the book she was reading, which was Robinson Crusoe, and which she found both exciting and practically instructive. Harlan listened to all of this with complete attention, asking questions, responding seriously, and Jennie watched her daughter with a fullness in her chest that was mixed up with other things she could not separate cleanly. Clara had been so still and self-contained since Thomas died. Jennie had never thought it wrong of her. It was just who Clara was becoming, managing her grief the same way her mother managed everything, by straightening her spine and getting on. But watching her talk now with the ease of a child who feels safe around someone was its own kind of water flowing where it had been blocked. After supper, Harlan helped clear the table, which Jennie told him was unnecessary, and he said that he was capable of carrying a plate from the table to the wash basin and intended to do so, and that was the end of that argument. Clara went to bed at her usual hour, insisting on saying goodnight to Harlan in the same formal manner she might use to bid goodnight to a senator, and he responded in kind, which made her very satisfied. Jennie and Harlan sat on the porch after, in the 2 chairs that faced west toward the darkening sky. The air had cooled with the evening, and the stars were coming out over the hills in the thick, brilliant way they came out in West Texas, which was different from anywhere else, because the sky was so wide and the land was so flat that there was nothing to stop the stars from going all the way down to the ground on every side. "You were going to Pico's," Jennie said. "I was," he said. "The cattle drive will have moved on." "Yes," he said. "The drovers will have found someone else to handle the last stretch." He did not sound troubled by this. "You gave up your wages for it," she said. "I didn't particularly need the wages," he said. "I have enough saved." She looked at him in the starlight. He was leaning back in his chair with his boots stretched out in front of him, looking at the sky with the comfortable ease of a man who has slept outside under that sky enough times to feel at home under it. He did not look like a man who had just made a sacrifice. He looked like a man who had made a choice and was at peace with it. "Why?" she asked. "Not ungrateful. Just needing to understand." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful and honest. "I saw the state of your ditch from the road and I knew exactly what it meant. I've seen irrigation failures ruin farms, and then I came into town and I heard the situation and he stopped. I could see what you needed was someone who knew how to fix it, and I knew how to fix it." He paused. "That is the simple answer." "Is there a less simple answer?" she asked. He looked at her then, turning his head from the stars. In the darkness, his eyes were very dark and very steady. "I saw you at that prayer meeting," he said slowly, "and you were standing there with your hands folded and your back straight, and you were not looking at the preacher. You were looking at the ground. And I thought that was not a woman who needed prayers as much as she needed someone to get to work." He stopped. "I wanted to be that someone." Jennie was quiet for a long moment. The night was full of crickets and the far-off cry of a coyote and the steady sound of water moving through her fixed ditch down the slope of her field. "That is a forward thing to say," she said, but not coldly. "Yes, ma'am," he agreed. "It is." He did not apologize for it. She looked back at the sky. "My neighbor Sarah Prescott is going to have opinions about you being here at supper," she said. "Is she the woman who was standing to your left at the prayer meeting wearing a hat with a lot of feathers in it?" Despite herself, Jennie laughed, a short, surprised sound that she had not expected to come out of her. "That is exactly who she is," she said. He smiled. She had not seen him smile fully before, not this directly, and it did something to his angular face that was entirely disarming. It made him look younger and warmer, and she looked away from it carefully. "I'll be riding on in the morning," he said, not as a question, as a fact placed between them for her to look at. "I expect you will," she said. Another silence. This one had a different quality. She could feel him thinking something and not saying it, and she found she was not hurrying him. "Unless," he said, "there was reason to stay a while longer." She made herself look at him. He was watching her with an expression that was careful and open and a little raw, the way a man's face looks when he has decided to be honest about something that could go badly for him. It was a kind of courage. She thought a different kind from the courage of hard work, but courage nonetheless. "What kind of reason did you have in mind?" she asked, and the calm of her own voice surprised her. "I have skills that are useful on a farm," he said carefully. "I can see several other things around this property that need attention. The corner post on the south pasture fence is leaning. The barn roof has a section that wants reshingling before the fall rains. Your pump handle is loose, which means the washers are going, and if they fail you'll lose your water supply from the well as the ditch." He paused. "I am not in a hurry to be anywhere, and I would like to be useful here, if you would have me." She studied him. She was, as she had established, a practical woman, and she could hear the practical offer underneath the words: his skills, her farm's needs, a straightforward exchange of labor. But she was also an honest woman, and she was honest enough with herself to know that practical was not the whole of what was being discussed here on this porch, under these stars, with this man looking at her in this particular way. "I have a reputation to consider," she said. "I am a widow in a small town. People will talk." "They will," he agreed, without trying to argue her out of it. "That is the truth of small towns. I would not want to be the cause of harm to your standing here." She thought about Sarah Prescott and her feathered hat and her opinions, and she thought about Abel Frost, who had come to help without being asked, and she thought about the way Millhaven's 200 souls knew her situation and had always treated her with reasonable decency, even while watching her from their porches. She thought about Clara presenting wildflowers with the gravity of a small judge. She thought about the water moving through the repaired ditch in the dark below her house. "You could board at the Millhaven house on Main Street," she said. "If you intended to stay and work, it would be more proper." "It would," he said. "And you could take your meals here," she said. "As fair exchange for the work, that is a reasonable arrangement." "It is," he said. There was nothing of triumph in his voice, just a quiet settling like water finding its level. "And Mr. Crawford," she began. "Harlan," he said. "Harlan," she said, and the name felt strange and right in her mouth at the same time. "This is a farm, not a courtship. I need to be clear about that." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and then very quietly, "I am patient." She went inside before she could say anything else, because she did not trust what else might come out if she stayed on that porch any longer. And she could hear him on the other side of the door letting himself out of the gate and mounting his horse and riding back toward town. And she stood in her kitchen in the dark and pressed her hands flat on the table and breathed. He stayed. He boarded at the Millhaven rooming house, paying his own way without complaint, and he came to her farm each morning and worked until the light was gone. He fixed the fence post. He re-shingled the barn roof with Jennie's help and a great deal of direction from Clara, who had assigned herself the role of supply superintendent and took it seriously. He replaced the pump washers. He rebuilt the chicken coop door that had been hanging wrong for a year. He looked at the south pasture and said the soil there was better than she was using it for, that if she planted winter wheat she could have a second income stream that would reduce her dependence on the single corn crop, and he walked her through the math of it until she agreed, and they ordered seed from the catalog in picos. People talked, as she had known they would. Sarah Prescott talked most and loudest, suggesting that it was improper for a widow to have a man about her property daily, and that Jennie Donnelly had always been headstrong, and this was the natural result of a woman trying to run a farm without proper male guidance, which was the kind of opinion that said more about Sarah Prescott than it did about Jennie. But Abel Frost told his wife that Harlan Crawford was a decent man who worked hard and minded his business, and Abel's wife told 3 other women that, and the general current of Millhaven's opinion was that the widow Donnelly's farm was looking better than it had in years, and whatever arrangements she had made were her own business. The Reverend Cobb, who had stayed an extra week in town, actually stopped by the farm one afternoon, ostensibly to call on Jennie but clearly curious about the man who had interrupted his prayer service, and left 2 hours later having had coffee and a long conversation with Harlan about irrigation theology, which appeared to be a topic he found unexpectedly interesting. And through all of it, Harlan was exactly what he had said he would be: patient. He was friendly and warm with Clara and respectful and attentive with Jennie, and he did not push at the edges of what they were to each other. He found 1,000 ways to be useful and kind without being aggressive about either. He brought her books from the lending library in Pecos when he made a supply run, because he had asked Clara what her mother liked to read, and Clara had told him. He taught Clara to identify the different rock formations along Cutter Creek one afternoon when they went to check the ditch intake, turning it into a quiet, absorbed lesson that Clara absorbed completely, and thereafter referred to as her geology education. He sat on the porch in the evening sometimes after supper and talked with Jennie about everything from the politics of water rights in the territory to the novels she was reading to the memory of his brother Cal, and he listened to her talk about Thomas without flinching or trying to redirect her, which no one else had ever properly managed. 2 weeks passed this way. Then 3. The corn came back. Not fully, the drought had taken its toll and the yield would be thinner than a good year, but it came back green and growing, and Jennie walked her rows in the early morning and could see it pulling itself upright toward the sky, and the sight of it made her feel the way she imagined a person felt after surviving something they had been certain would finish them. Stubborn, grateful, a little astonished. It was on a Saturday evening in mid-August, with the fields looking their best and the evening cooling pleasantly and Clara asleep inside, that things changed between them. They were sitting on the porch as they often did now, And Jennie had been telling him about the first year she and Thomas had farmed this land, how green and young they had been, how Thomas had been so certain about everything and usually right, how they had planted everything wrong the first spring and learned from it, and planted correctly the second spring, how she had fallen in love with the land itself as much as anything, how she could not imagine leaving it even when it was hardest. She had been talking freely and easily, the way she had learned to talk with him, and she stopped suddenly in the middle of a sentence because she had been looking at him in the lamplight from the window while she talked, and she had seen it again, that expression she kept seeing and kept setting aside, and this time she did not set it aside. "Harlan," she said. "Jennie," he said. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. "I think I should tell you something," she said carefully. "All right," he said. I am not indifferent to you," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I have tried to be very sensible about the situation because I am a practical woman and because you have been a good neighbor and a good helper, and I did not want to complicate that. But I am not indifferent to you." He looked at her steadily. "I know," he said. "I am not indifferent to you either. I think you know that." "I do," she said. "What would you like to do about it?" He asked, and the question was simple and respectful and left everything in her hands, and she thought that was possibly the most important thing any man had ever done for her. She looked at her hands in her lap. "I love Thomas," she said. "I want you to know that. It wasn't a hard marriage or an unhappy one. He was a good man. I grieve him still." "I know," Harlan said. "You should. He was your husband and Clara's father, and by all accounts a good man. That doesn't diminish. It isn't supposed to." She looked at him. "No," she said softly, "it isn't. But grief and life don't cancel each other out," he said. "They run alongside each other. I know that from my own." He paused. "I am not asking you to set Thomas aside. I would never ask that." She looked at him for a long moment in the lamplit dark, at his angular, honest face, at the patience in it, at the warmth she had been watching for weeks build steadily behind his careful eyes. "You are a very good man, Harlan Crawford," she said quietly. "I am trying to be," he said. She reached across the small space between their chairs and put her hand over his where it rested on the arm of the chair. His hand turned under hers and held it, and they sat like that in the warm Texas night with the stars overhead and the water running in the fixed ditch below the house, and said nothing else for a while because nothing else needed saying. He did not kiss her that night. She did not expect him to. It was not a moment that needed anything added to it. It was enough on its own. But things were different after that, in the way that acknowledged things become different from unacknowledged ones, even when the outer circumstances change very little. He still boarded in town and came each morning to the farm. They still ate supper at the same table. Clara still fell asleep in the evenings with her Robinson Crusoe open on her chest. But there was something easier and more open between them, as though a window had been raised that they had both been careful not to touch. And now the air moved through freely. He asked her to ride with him one Sunday, out to a stretch of land he had seen east of town that he thought was worth looking at. She left Clara with Abel Frost's wife for the afternoon, and rode beside him on her old mare, Bess, out along the dry rocky terrain east of Millhaven, where the land opened up into a wide basin between two low ridges. She could see at once what he was looking at. The basin caught runoff from both ridges and fed down into a seasonal creek bed. In a wet year it would hold significant water. With the right work, it could be made to hold water in dry years too. "There are 320 acres available here for homestead claim," he said. "I looked it up at the county office in Pecos last week." She looked at him. "You went to Pecos for this?" "I had other business there," he said. He was looking at the land with that calculating, measuring look she had come to know. "But yes, I wanted to know about this land." She looked at the basin, the pale limestone ridges, the dark soil of the flood plain, the bleached creek bed winding through the center. She could see it the way he saw it. She had learned to see land that way, working alongside him. "It would need a good deal of work," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "But the bones are right. The soil is good. With the right water management it could run cattle and grain both." He paused. "I have savings enough to file the claim and build a house, Not elaborate but sound. She was very still. "Harlan." "I know," he said immediately. "I know this is fast. I know you have the farm and your life here, and I am not asking you to. I am not telling you what this is. I am just showing you land and telling you what I see in it." She looked at him. He was watching her with an openness that was almost difficult to look at directly, the way you cannot look directly at the sun even though you want to. "What do you see?" she asked. He took a breath. "A place worth staying for," he said. He met her eyes. "I see a place worth staying for. That is what I see." She turned back to look at the basin. A hawk was circling over the far ridge, riding a thermal upward in slow, patient spirals. The land was quiet and dry and full of potential. She thought about 40 acres of corn and a repaired ditch and a repaid bank debt, and Clara studying Robinson Crusoe and winter wheat seed in the catalog, and the feel of his hand under hers on the porch arm. She thought about Thomas, and she thought about 3 years of managing alone, and she thought about what it felt like to not have to manage alone. "Show me where the house would go," she said. He looked at her for a moment with something crossing his face that was so purely hopeful it made her chest ache. And then he clicked his horse into a walk and rode down the slope of the basin, and she rode beside him. September came in with a breath of cooler air from the north, and the worst of the summer heat broke. The corn was harvested thin, as Harlan had predicted, but respectable enough that Jennie was able to meet most of her obligations to the bank, with a smaller balance remaining that she negotiated to carry forward. The winter wheat was planted. The farm looked better than it had in 2 years, and Jennie Donnelly looked better too. Or so Sarah Prescott said to 3 different women, in a tone that was annoyed about it, as though a woman in better spirits was somehow a personal inconvenience to her. There were conversations between Jennie and Harlan during September that she would remember for the rest of her life long, winding conversations on the porch, or walking the fence lines, or sitting in the kitchen after Clara went to bed. Conversations that covered his life and hers, his plans and hers, what they each believed about work and land and faith, and the raising of children, and the management of loss and the possibility of starting over. They fought once, a real argument, quick and sharp, about whether Harlan had been too high-handed in ordering a load of fence wire for the south pasture without asking her first, and she told him plainly that this was her farm and her decisions, and he could not simply order things on her account. And he listened and acknowledged that she was entirely right and apologized without qualification, and that was the end of it, but she felt the importance of the argument afterward. The importance of the fact that she could be angry with him and say so and he would hear it. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, a great deal. Clara had her 8th birthday on the 14th of September, and Harlan produced a copy of Treasure Island from somewhere, wrapped in brown paper with a length of red ribbon tied around it, which made Clara sit very still for a moment the way she did when she felt something strongly and was deciding how to hold it. Then she said thank you to Harlan with the gravity of a judge pronouncing a favorable verdict, and took the book to her room and did not emerge for 2 hours. "You have made a friend for life," Jennie told him. "She already had my complete respect," he said, smiling. It seemed right to express it. She was making a pie at the kitchen table when he said this, and she looked at him across the pastry board with flour on her hands and thought, clearly and without flinching, "I love this man." It was not a panic or a revelation. It was more like the recognition of something that had already arrived and settled in while she was looking the other way, like finding that winter wheat has already come up green while you were watching the corn. She looked at it for a moment and then looked back at her pie crust and rolled it smooth. That same evening she asked him to walk with her down to the ditch. Just the 2 of them, Clara inside with her book. The evening was cool and the sky was the pale purple color it got in September before full dark, and the water moved steadily in the repaired channel, glinting in the last light. "I need to say something to you," she said. "All right," he said. She stopped at the repaired section and turned to face him. The light was going fast, but she could see his face well enough. I have been thinking a great deal about what you said at the East Basin, she began. About a place worth staying for. Yes, he said quietly. I am not a woman who does things halfway, she said. I want you to know that about me going forward. He looked at her with a tension that was absolute. I know that about you, he said. I have known it since the day you told me a man should be paid for his work. Something in her chest released. Then I would like to tell you that I have come to love you, she said plainly in the practical way she did things. Not carelessly or in a rush, carefully and truly and with my eyes open. And I would like to know whether you intend to file that land claim. He stepped toward her. I intend to file it, he said. And I intend to ask you to marry me, Jennie Donnelly, if you will permit me to do that. I intend to ask it properly with enough time for you to think and enough. I do not need more time, she said. He stopped. I have had 3 years to understand my own mind, she said. And I have had 3 months to understand you. And I am a practical woman, Harlan. I do not need. He stepped close enough that he could take her hands in his, and he held them, her calloused, flour-dusted, hard-working hands, with the same care he had put into every stone of her irrigation ditch, and he looked at her directly in the last of the September evening light. Jennie Donnelly, he said, his voice gone low and certain, will you marry me? Yes, she said, I will. He kissed her then for the first time, and it was nothing like the tentative or performative kisses she might have expected from a man who had been so measured and careful. It was direct and warm and certain, the way he was, the way everything he did was, and she kissed him back the same way, and they stood at the edge of her irrigation ditch in the September dusk, and the water ran past them and the stars came out overhead. When they went back inside, Clara was sitting at the kitchen table with Treasure Island closed in front of her and her arms folded, looking at them with the expression of someone who had suspected this was coming and had been waiting for the official announcement. Are you going to tell me something? She asked. Jennie and Harlan looked at each other. Then Jennie sat down across from her daughter. Harlan has asked me to marry him, she said, and I have said yes. But I wanted to talk to you about it before anything is settled because you are the most important person in this family and this matters to you as much as it matters to me. Clara looked at Harlan, who was standing at the edge of the table, his hat in his hands, watching her with the same seriousness he always gave her. Do you love my mother? Clara asked him. Yes, Miss Clara, he said, very much. Do you intend to leave? She asked. No, he said, I intend to stay. On this farm and on the land east of town that I mean to file on, which will be our land together, your mother's and mine and yours. Clara unfolded her arms and looked at her book for a moment, appearing to think. Then she looked up at her mother with the measuring look that was so entirely her own. I think that is acceptable, she said. Jennie laughed, a full, warm laugh that filled the kitchen, and Harlan ducked his head and smiled, and Clara looked satisfied with the effect she had produced. They were married in October, in the little white church in Millhaven, by a minister who had come down from Pecos for the occasion because Reverend Cobb had moved along his circuit weeks earlier, but had left a letter at the church, saying that he was glad to have been present at the beginning of something, though of course at the time he had not known what it was. Abel Frost stood up for Harlan. Sarah Prescott came to the wedding wearing her feathered hat and looking tight-lipped, but appeared to relax by the reception and ate 2 pieces of pie, and told Jennie that her dress was very becoming. Clara wore a white dress with a blue sash and walked beside her mother up the aisle with the composure of a small queen, and when the minister asked who gave this woman in marriage, Clara said clearly and without hesitation, I do, which made half the congregation laugh and the other half reach for handkerchiefs, and the minister said that was entirely proper and continued. The land claim on the East Basin was filed the day after the wedding, by Harlan Crawford with his wife Jennie Crawford's name placed alongside his from the beginning. He did not make a ceremony of this, but she found out about it from the clerk at the county office when she went to Pecos in November to handle the final paperwork on her corn yield, and she came home and found him mending fence on the south pasture and stood at the fence line and told him what she had learned. He looked up from the fence post. "Your name belongs on it," he said simply. "You could have told me you had done it," she said. "I did not want to make a speech about it," he said. "It seemed like the right thing and I did it." She looked at him for a long moment in the November cold, with the dry grass crackling around his boots and his breath making small clouds in the air. "You are a very aggravating man sometimes," she said, "because you keep doing things that make it very difficult to stay a sensible and practical woman." He smiled at her. "I'll try to be more considerate," he said. "No, you will not," she said. "Do not even pretend." She turned around and went back to the house, and he called after her, and she called back something that made him laugh, and she went inside smiling so widely she had to stop in the kitchen and collect herself before she started on supper. Winter came to West Texas with its peculiar cold, not the deep cold of the northern territories, but the bitter, dry cold that comes when there is nothing between you and the wind for 200 miles. Harlan spent the winter months working on the East Basin land, not building yet, but preparing, clearing, testing soil, planning the water management. He had a particular vision for it, and he worked toward that vision with the same patient steadiness he brought to everything. Some weeks he slept on the property in a tent to maximize his working hours, and Jennie brought food out to him and they ate together under the canvas, while the cold wind moved over the basin, and Clara, who had come along on these trips, took geological notes in a small journal Harlan had given her. On one of these evenings, eating beans and biscuits in the lamplight of the tent while the wind pushed at the canvas walls, Clara looked up from her geological journal and said to Harlan, "You are the second person I have had a father. The first one was also a good one." Harlan set down his cup. Jennie went very still. "Your father Thomas sounds like he was a fine man," Harlan said carefully. "From everything I have come to know of him through your mother and you." "He was," Clara said, with the matter-of-fact gravity that was her particular gift. "I am glad he was the first one, and I am glad you are the second one." Harlan nodded once slowly and said, "I am honored to be, Miss Clara." Clara nodded in return and went back to her geological notes, and Jennie looked across the lamplight at Harlan and found that words were completely unavailable to her. So she reached out and covered his hand with hers, and he turned his hand to hold it, just as he had that night on the porch, and that was enough. Spring came earlier than usual in 1884, which the old-timers said was a sign that rain would follow, and they were right. March and April brought 3 weeks of steady rain that filled the creeks and softened the soil, and made the winter wheat come up in a green wave across Jennie's south pasture that she stood and looked at for 10 minutes one morning, just stood there in the fine rain with her face turned up, and let herself feel how good it was. The winter wheat yield that spring was better than the corn yield in a good year. The bank debt was paid in full by May, and Jennie Donnelly Crawford went to the bank in Pecos and made that final payment in person, and the bank manager told her she had done very well for herself, and she thanked him and privately thought that she had done very well full stop, and the credit was shared. Construction began on the East Basin house in late April, once the ground had dried enough after the rains. Harlan had drawn the plans himself over the winter, a solid house, well sited to catch the prevailing breeze and face away from the worst weather, with thick walls for the summer heat and a deep porch running the length of the south side. He had planned a room for Clara with a south window that would catch the best light for reading, and when Clara saw the plans she looked at that room for a long moment, and then looked at Harlan with an expression that was, for once, entirely unguarded and entirely transparent. Abel Frost and 2 of his farmhands came to help with the framing, and several other men from Millhaven came on the days the heavy work was being done, because that was how things were done in small communities in West Texas. You helped your neighbors raise their buildings the same way you expected them to come when you raised yours. There was a house-raising party when the frame went up, with a barrel of sweet tea and cornbread and Jennie's roast chicken feeding 20 people in the afternoon sun, and old Henry Hargrove played fiddle on a nail keg until the sun went down, and several people danced on the flat ground of the basin. Sarah Prescott came to the party, feathered hat and all, and told Jennie that the house was going to be very respectable and that she had always felt Jennie Donnelly had more sense than she sometimes showed. Jennie thanked her sincerely and gave her an extra piece of chicken. By early June, the house was finished. Not elaborate 4 rooms and the deep porch and a good stone chimney and a root cellar dug into the north slope of the ridge, but solid in the way that Harlan Crawford built things, with every joint fitted true and every stone laid to hold. They moved in on a Saturday, their possessions from the Millhaven farm loaded in the wagon and Bess tied behind, and Clara rode in the wagon bed surrounded by boxes, reading Treasure Island, entirely composed. The Millhaven farm, Jennie's original 40 acres, they leased to a young couple named Ridley who had come from Oklahoma Territory and were looking to get started. It was a good arrangement for everyone. The Ridleys were hardworking and honest, and Jennie felt satisfied that the land Thomas had built would be worked properly, and the lease income was a useful addition to their resources. The East Basin land, which they had come to call the Crawford Basin unofficially, though it showed on the county plat simply as Crawford Claim 1884, came alive under Harlan's water management plan. The irrigation system he built there was far more sophisticated than the single ditch at the old farm, a network of channels that caught and directed the basin's natural runoff into a series of holding areas that released water steadily through the dry months. He had designed it over the winter, drawing on everything he had learned in New Mexico and everything he had observed about the specific behavior of this land's water. And when he explained it to Jennie, she understood every element of it because he had taught her to read land and water the way he read them. They ran 30 head of cattle on the basin land by fall of 1884 and planted a grain field and a kitchen garden, and the water system worked exactly as Harlan had planned it. It was not wealth, not the ease and abundance that some people elsewhere were finding in those years, but it was sound and growing and theirs, and there was a satisfaction in it that Jennie recognized as the deepest kind, the kind that comes from making something real and lasting out of difficulty. In the evenings on the deep south porch, with the basin spread out before them in the warm September air, Jennie would sometimes look at everything and think about that Sunday morning at the prayer meeting in the terrible dry July, when she had been standing with her hands folded and her eyes on the ground, and she would feel something that was gratitude and astonishment and love all at once, tangled together too thoroughly to separate. On one such evening, Harlan found her standing at the porch rail looking out at the basin in the last light, and he came to stand beside her, and she leaned her shoulder against his arm, which she had come to do without thinking, the way you do with someone whose presence has become as natural as your own breathing. "Are you thinking solemn thoughts?" he asked. "Grateful ones," she said. "That's different," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "Very." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they looked out at the basin together, the irrigated fields catching the last gold of the evening light, the stone-lined channels glinting where the water moved through them, the far ridges turning purple and the first stars coming up above them. And then she told him. She had been waiting for the right moment, and this seemed like it, with the evening this beautiful and the land this alive and his arms solid around her shoulders. "I am expecting a child," she said. He went very still beside her, and then she felt him breathe, a slow, deep breath that seemed to come from somewhere central and important. "Jennie," he said. His voice was not his usual measured voice. It was lower and rougher at the edges. "April, I think," she said, "or late March." He turned to her and took her face in both his hands and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, not the steadiness or the patience or the careful warmth she knew, but something more open and undefended, something that made her understand that all this time, all the patience and care and measured steadiness, there was this under it, this depth that she had known was there but had never quite seen the surface of before. "We're going to have a child," he said, as though confirming something he needed to say aloud. "We are," she said. He kissed her, They're on the porch in the September dusk, with the basin spread out before them and the water moving in its channels and the stars coming in overhead. And she put her arms around him and kissed him back with the same certainty and depth, and there was nothing held back in either of them. Clara, who had been sitting inside reading, appeared in the doorway after a moment and observed this scene with the equanimity of a child who has been paying careful attention for some time. "Is there news?" she asked. Jennie looked at Harlan. Harlan looked at Jennie. "Come here, Clara," Jennie said, and held out her hand, and Clara came and took it, and Jennie told her she was going to have a brother or a sister come spring, and Clara looked at this information with great seriousness for a moment and then looked at Harlan. "What do you want it to be?" she asked him. "A healthy child," he said. "That is all I want." Clara appeared to find this an acceptable answer. She looked back at Jennie. "I would not mind a brother," she said thoughtfully. "There are enough girls on this property. The ratio is already tilted." Jennie laughed, and Harlan laughed, and Clara smiled the particular small contained smile she allowed herself when she had made people laugh. And the three of them stood on the porch of the house Harlan had built in the basin, as the last of the September light slid off the ridges, and the stars came fully out. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was milder than the one before, and Jennie was grateful for it, because she was pregnant, and while she was not a woman who made a performance of difficulty, she appreciated a winter that did not add cold and wind to everything else her body was doing. She worked through most of it, managing the house and the kitchen garden and the accounts and the ongoing negotiations with the Ridleys about the lease farm. But she accepted help more readily than she once had, which was something Harlan noticed and did not comment on but responded to, quietly covering what he could so she could rest without feeling she was failing at something. Clara turned 9 in September and had become, under Harlan's patient tutelage and her own relentless intellectual absorption, something of an expert on the water management system of the Crawford Basin, which she could explain in detail to anyone who asked, and several who did not. She had also progressed through Treasure Island, Robinson Crusoe, a worn copy of The Last of the Mohicans that Abel Frost had produced from somewhere, and was currently working her way through a basic geology textbook that Harlan had written away for to a publisher in San Antonio. She had informed her family on several occasions, to study the sciences. Harlan had said that was a very fine intention and what branch in particular, and she had said hydrology, and he had said that was an extremely useful branch, and he would help her all he could, and she had said she knew, which was why she had decided on it. On the 28th of March, 1885, in the bedroom of the Crawford Basin house, with the midwife from Millhaven present and Abel Frost's wife boiling water in the kitchen, and Harlan pacing the front porch in a manner entirely unlike his usual calm, Jennie Crawford gave birth to a son. He was a solid, dark-haired boy who came into the world at dawn with a voice that filled the house, and when the midwife brought him to Harlan on the porch, wrapped in the flannel blanket Jennie had made over the winter, Harlan stood holding him in the growing light of the March morning, and looked at him with an expression that was so purely overwhelmed with tenderness that Jennie, watching from the doorway where the midwife had helped her stand, felt tears running down her face that she made no attempt to stop. Clara appeared at Jennie's elbow. She looked at the baby in Harlan's arms. She looked at her mother. She looked at the baby again. "He is very small," she observed. "He will grow," Jennie said. "He is also very loud," Clara said. "He comes by that honestly," Jennie said, and Clara looked at her with a small raised eyebrow and then looked back at the baby with the beginning of an expression that was, under all the 9-year-old composure and analytical distance, simply delighted. They named him Thomas Cal Crawford. Thomas for Jennie's first husband and Clara's father, because it was right and good to carry that name forward. Cal for Harlan's brother, because Harlan had carried that loss alone for 5 years, and it deserved to be placed somewhere lasting. The name held both of their histories and pointed toward the future at the same time, which seemed to Jennie like exactly the right thing a name should do. Harlan held his son in the morning light and said the name quietly, Thomas Cow, and something in his face settled, a long-held tension releasing, and he looked at Jennie over the baby's head with eyes that said everything he was and everything he felt and everything he intended, and she looked back at him and understood all of it. The years that came after were good years. Not without difficulty. There were dry seasons and wet ones, good yields and poor ones, a cattle illness one fall that cost them 8 head, a dispute with a neighbor to the east over water rights that Harlan handled through the county court with patience and precision, and ultimately won fairly. Clara grew into herself with the particular certainty of a child who had been seen clearly from the beginning, and at 16, she was writing letters to the university at Austin inquiring about education for women, and at 17, she had a plan, and Harlan had been corresponding with a professor of natural sciences on her behalf since the previous fall, and Jennie watched all of it with a pride so large she sometimes did not know what to do with it. Thomas Cow grew into a sturdy, curious, irrepressible boy who took after both his parents in different ways. Jennie's tenacity and Harlan's patience, and his own particular brand of warmth that was neither his mother's nor his father's but entirely his own. By the time he was 3, he was following Harlan along the irrigation channels every morning, asking why about everything, and Harlan answered every question with the same complete seriousness he gave everything, so that by the time Thomas Cow was 4, he understood the basic principles of water flow and gravity, which made Abel Frost laugh so hard the second time the boy explained it to him that he had to sit down. And then, in the spring of 1888, when Thomas Cow was just past 3 and Clara was 12, and the Crawford Basin was running full and green after a good winter's rain, Jennie told Harlan she was expecting again. This time he did not still and breathe and look at her with that deep, unguarded look, or rather he did all of those things, but he also laughed, a full and easy laugh of a man who is genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy, and he picked her up and spun her once, right there in the kitchen, and she told him to put her down and she was laughing too. Thomas Cow, watching from the doorway, said, "Why are you spinning, Mama?" With the interested curiosity of a 3-year-old who considers all adult behavior a legitimate subject for investigation. "Because I am very happy," Harlan said, setting Jennie down. Thomas Cow considered this. "You could spin me too," he offered helpfully. Harlan picked him up and spun him, and the boy shouted with delight, and Jennie stood in her kitchen in the spring morning laughing at both of them, and the window was open, and the smell of the wet earth after the winter rains came through it, and somewhere down the slope of the basin she could hear the water moving in Harlan's channels, steady and purposeful and alive. In November of 1888, a girl was born. They named her Mary Ellen Crawford, after Harlan's mother who had died young, and she came into the world quietly, with dark eyes open and looking around with an alertness that made the midwife say this one sees everything. And she was right, because Mary Ellen Crawford grew into a child who noticed things that everyone around her missed and kept her own counsel about them, which was a trait she appeared to have invented entirely independently. Thomas Cow adored her immediately and without reservation. Clara, home from a school term in San Antonio, held her baby sister with the careful, completely competent manner of someone who has read about child development and means to apply what she has learned, and told Jennie that Mary Ellen had exceptional hand grip for her age, which was probably right. On the evening of the day Mary Ellen was born, after the midwife had gone, and the children were settled, and Jennie was resting in the bedroom with the new baby asleep in the cradle Harlan had made from mesquite wood over the previous months. Harlan sat in the chair beside the bed and held Jennie's hand, and they talked quietly in the lamplight the way they had talked on 100 evenings before, easy and unhurried, covering everything and nothing. The particular language of two people who have built a life together and know its every room. "Are you happy?" he asked her at some point, Not because he did not know the answer, but because he liked to ask and she liked to answer. She looked at the sleeping baby, and at the window where the November stars were coming in over the ridge, and at him, his familiar face in the lamplight, still angular and honest and a little marked now by the years and the weather, but warm in the way it had always been warm, patient in the way it had always been patient. "Yes," she said, "completely." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles with a tenderness that was entirely characteristic of him, not showy, not performative, just true. "Good," he said. "Me too." Outside, the water moved in its channels through the November night, feeding the holding ponds, keeping the basin alive through the dry months, doing what water does when it has been guided correctly, sustaining everything that depends on it, asking nothing, giving everything. Harlan Crawford had built that system with his own hands and Jennie's beside him, and it would run as long as the stone held and the clay was sound. "Not in your lifetime," he had said, kneeling in her irrigation ditch on the 3rd day of August in 1883, pressing the new clay lining smooth. He had been talking about the ditch. But she thought about it sometimes as she stood on the south porch in the evening with his arm around her shoulders, looking out at everything they had made together, and she thought it applied to more than just the ditch. Not in your lifetime the good things he had built. Not in your lifetime the love he had brought. Not in your lifetime. And she was grateful down to the bone, down to the bedrock, down to wherever good things live when they are made to last.